Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is the last of the preservation series. So I'm going to be talking about freezing. And freezing is extremely easy. There's only two real downsides that I'm going to go in more depth in this vid. But the big thing is ice damage can be a problem. More on that and how to mitigate it as much as possible. And then the other thing is you do need a freezer, which means you need something that's electric, which means if a grid is down or something like that, you could run into trouble. Um, this is why freezing wasn't really a thing up until really like it wasn't normalized until the middle of the 20th century. Before then, cellaring was how people kept things cool. And in the right conditions, cellaring is an awful lot like refrigerating and to a much lesser extent freezing, but not nowhere near as effective because whenever you create ice crystals around something, it becomes very difficult for bacteria to colonize it at all. Not just because they slow down as temperatures lower, but also because ice crystals actually will impale the cells of the bacteria. The downside to that, and this is where I was going with that, is those same ice crystals will impale the cells of whatever it is you're freezing. And since I mentioned in a previous video, all food except for salt is comprised of a dead organism and therefore is made of cells, it's pretty much impossible not to rupture some cells in the freezing process. There's a silver lining though, and that is the way you want to freeze something is quickly because ice crystals that form very quickly are small and ice crystals that form slowly are big. And so the faster you freeze something, the less damage is done. And this is why like flash freezing, which is done with like liquid hydrogen or liquid nitrogen, both are used in different circumstances on board of like fishing vessels. I mean that fish when you thaw it, yeah, they call it jet fresh sometimes. It's not really any different from just being caught. I mean, it might go down in quality a little, but we're talking almost imperceptibly. So freezing something very quickly is important. So what you want to do if you are freezing things, and this is under ideal circumstances, is chill it first where it's relatively cool, and then put it in very cold temperature. So make sure your freezer is up to snuff to freeze things quickly. And the other big thing is avoiding retention of moisture because more water means more crystals. And more water also means more things to freeze, which means slightly bigger crystals. So minimizing the amount of water present also minimizes the amount of ice crystals that can puncture things. And this is where freezer burn becomes the issue because freezer burn is usually caused by condensation of excess water. So if you seal what you're freezing airtight and then you freeze it quickly, you greatly increase the likelihood of not having those big crystals that will end up making for really mushy food. And sometimes it's not the end of the world. Like for fruit, it's not horrible. It's not preferable, but it's not horrible, especially if you're going to make a smoothie out of it anyway. But if you're talking beef or fish or chicken, those crystals can just ruin your day. And with dairy, it's significantly even worse because dairy has a high fat content. So if you have condensation getting in it, and anybody who's ever had freezer burn ice cream can attest to this, you've pretty much just changed the entire structural integrity of what you've frozen to something that's borderline unpalatable. And I mean that's coming from somebody whose favorite vice is ice cream. And if you freezer burn ice cream, it's just a twisted parody of what it was. So when it comes to freezing, you have to use that kind of judgment. You know, you have to think if I'm keeping this for insert period of time here, would I prefer it? Would it be more palatable and have a similar, if not better, shelf life if I preserved it via fermentation, canning, even drying? I would much rather have beef jerky than a steak that wasn't frozen properly. You know, it does. It can really mess with it. But the important thing is to freeze it quickly. And there are some paradoxes when it comes to that. Like, I've heard a lot of people argue, well, if you put something in the fridge and you cool it down, and I just mentioned this earlier in the vid, and then you freeze it, you minimize those ice crystals. But I've also heard people point out that if something is hot, paradoxically, it freezes faster. And that's actually true. The downside to that is if you heat something up to a point, it can enter the danger zone, what's a temperature range for bacterial colonization. And if you freeze it at that point, if there's enough bacteria on there that have created toxins, because most symptoms from diseases aren't actually caused by the presence of bacteria. They're caused by the products that those bacteria produce. So you can still get sick if you heat something up and then freeze it immediately, assuming that it's been at that temperature for a certain period. So I actually think it is better just in terms of safety, even if the paradoxical freezing uh, improves the consistency and texture of the food. I would rather have food that's slightly less qualitatively enjoyable than food that put at risk for getting sick later. Because again, that's kind of the whole point of food preservation. It's not to enjoy it longer, even though that's definitely a factor. It's to be able to eat it without getting sick. That's the real goal of preservation. I mean, that's a lot of people prefer fresh cabbage to sauerkraut. I don't, but still, I like cabbage, but sauerkraut's better. But for a lot of people, they made it not because it was qualitatively better, but because you just can't keep a cabbage around for very long and not get sick. You're better off making sauerkraut out of it. So those are things to all consider when you're freezing. The nice thing about freezing, though, is if you do have an adequate setup for it and you uh, don't really want to go into the other forms of preservation, or you just want to diversify your preserved food portfolio, it can be great. And it's something that I do for beef, for example, because it's just not realistic to have a whole cow and butcher it and have it all eaten within a period of a day or two. That's physically impossible. So freezing cuts of meat is pretty much what I focus more on. Like fruits, even though you can freeze them effectively, and I've made freezer jam, for example. That's where you make a jam that does have a lower sugar content than regular jam, but you can freeze it. Really good. Highly recommend it, and you don't really have to worry about the ice crystals puncturing it because all those cells have been dissolved anyway into a gel. But for the most part, when I freeze things, I freeze meat. Fish is a big one too. You catch fish, you freeze them as soon as possible. Which for me, since I don't have like a sea trawler with a liquid nitrogen or hydrogen compartment, that means taking it home and freezing it. But still, freezing something effectively just means getting that temperature to go from not freezing to freezing really quickly so that those ice crystals that form are small. Because again, those big ones, I know I'm repeating myself, but the big ice crystals, that's where you get the mushy, gross texture or the freezer burnt texture. So sealing them airtight is paramount, and that goes double for fish. You really want to vacuum seal fish before you freeze them, and I would recommend vacuum sealing all meats before freezing them to prevent that condensation. But it goes double for fish and shellfish because you're going to compromise the integrity of the bag otherwise, because you can actually get to a point where those ice crystals can penetrate the bag, and then all bets are off anyway. So that's my recommendation. But freezing is very effective if you're willing to have an electric setup and you're not as worried about a possible energy issue relating to that. And of course, you can always have a generator that can expedite that. The big downside is it's not a medieval solution. There are people who, when they prepare for things, they aren't looking at a wide array of problems. They're looking at like full blown, complete and utter collapse of society, where it's 1200 AD all over again. And if that's the case, yeah, you're not going to be able to get Freon, and you're not going to be able to have a sustainable power grid for your freezer. But I think that's very unlikely, and I think if you want to experiment with all forms of preservation, freezing is something that I absolutely use regularly, and I recommend as long as those rules are followed. So that's all I got. Like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.